Showing equals emphasis. To show something is to emphasize it. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Tara East. I'm a creative writing teacher, an editor, a YouTuber, and the author of the mystery novel Every Time He Dies. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about showing versus telling, but please do not switch off the video. I'm going to have a fresh angle on this topic, I promise. So as writers, we are often told to show instead of tell. But the thing about these two literary techniques, when people often speak about them, they position them as two binary opposites. You were either showing or you were either telling, rather than presenting them as a spectrum. Now, sometimes you are 100% just telling or 100% showing, but often there's a little bit of wiggle room between the two, and that's what I'm going to be trying to show within this video, as well as how you marry showing and telling together in order to create a complete scene and a very satisfying reading experience. Within this video, I'll talk about showing and telling in more sort of basic terms, then I'll show a bunch of examples and we'll talk about how you can do some telling that looks a little bit more like showing and how you can switch between these two different literary techniques depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. A lot of writers who are still developing their craft will often get the feedback from beta readers or early readers to show instead of tell. Editing Tara jumping in here. So another common problem with emerging writers is that there's an imbalance in their writing and they have a tendency to tell much more or far more than they show. Now this kind of makes sense because when we're in conversation and we're sharing a story with someone, we often tell them what happened. So let's look at an example. Let's say that you're having a dinner party and you're telling a guest about your day. You might say something like, "It was 40 degrees and I had to drive all the way across town in a car that didn't have aircon. I'd already been to 3 grocery stores and none of them had the ingredient that I needed for the dinner party. I then arrived at the 4th boutique grocer only to find that the store had already closed." Now, let's see what those same events might look like if we were to show rather than tell. Beads of sweat rolled down my forehead as I slid back into the driver's seat and snapped the car door shut. The empty confectionery shelves seemed to mock me through the corner store's window. I punched the location of the 4th boutique grocer into my phone, closing the notification that there was only 10% battery left. I rolled into the empty parking lot 30 minutes later, just in time to see the grey-haired proprietor flip their sign over to closed. Now, you could arguably tell the story in this same way to your guests, but it would probably feel a little bit excessive. And yet, in fiction, we want these immersive details, or at least sometimes. Now, we often use these terms, showing and telling, but if you feel like that terminology is a little bit confusing or it's creating a barrier because you've heard them so much, then you might prefer to use terms like summary and imagery, or summary and scene. Now in this video, I'll largely use the terms showing and telling, but occasionally you might see me using these other terms, summary and imagery, or summary and scene. So let's take a closer look at that second example, sentence by sentence. Beads of sweat rolled down my forehead as I slid back into the driver's seat and snapped the car door shut. Now this sentence includes clear imagery through the beads of sweat and our character sliding into the car seat, but we also have these sensory details. We can feel the sweat rolling down our forehead and we can hear the snap of the car door. Now this is also considered showing, but I also want to highlight here the use of more interesting verbs, rolled, slid, snapped, which assist in making the sentence much more engaging and interesting. The sentence would be less engaging, for example, if we were to maybe reconfigure it and use more standard verbs. For example, my forehead was sweaty as I sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. You'll notice that this sentence leans far more towards telling than it does towards showing. Now let's look at the second sentence. The empty confectionery shelves seemed to mock me through the corner store's window. Here we are showing the empty shelf, we can see some insight into our character's psyche through the comment that the shelves are mocking them. And we have the final closing image where we are looking through the corner store's window. Now, arguably, this sentence is kind of interesting because it is a little bit telling, but we have the voiciness of the character with seems to mock me, and we've got the specific details of the corner store window and the empty confectionery shelf, which make it feel a lot more like showing. Now let's look at the third sentence. I punched the location of the fourth grocer into Maps, ignoring the notification that there was only 10% battery left. Again, we have the clear image of the narrator using their app and then closing the pop-up notification, and we have some internal insight with the single word ignoring, which also assists in developing a voiciness within this sentence, which makes it feel much more like showing. I rolled into the empty parking lot 30 minutes later, just in time to see the grey-haired proprietor flip their sign over to closed. Now there are three clear images in this sentence. We have the empty parking lot, we have the store owner, and we have the store's closed sign. We also have some nice specific details with the comment that it took 30 minutes to get here. Okay, so now that we've looked at one paragraph and then sort of broken it down into different sentences, I want to build up a paragraph. So we're going to start with a telling sentence, a sentence that's 100% telling, and then build it up into a full scene that combines both of these techniques so that you can really see how they can work together. So let's start with the sentence, I am happy. This is a straightforward, simple sentence that is 100% telling. It is a statement of fact that tells us the narrator is happy, even if we don't know why they are happy. Now let's build that sentence out a little bit more. I am happy that it's the weekend. Another simple sentence that is 100% pure telling, but now we have some more information. I am happy because it's the weekend. We know why the character is happy now. Okay, so let's add in some imagery to make the sentence more engaging. I loosen my tie the moment I step through the front gate. Sliding the key into the lock, my whole body instantly relaxes. I am happy that it's the weekend. Now those first two sentences are showing. I'm showing the character's movements, and through their movements and through word choice, we're also getting a sense of where the character is at emotionally. And then of course the final sentence is telling. Now let's look at even more showing. I loosen my tie the moment I step through the front gate. Sliding the key into the lock, my whole body instantly relaxes. I can already smell my famous garlic and rosemary marinade. Inside, I pull the battered tray I inherited from my mother down from the top shelf and set it on the bench. I'm happy that it's the weekend. So in this example, obviously we're getting even more detail, and we're also getting a little bit of history about the author, and we're getting a little bit more insight into their personality and who they might be. Potentially they're someone who works a corporate job of some kind. It's obviously very exhausting and taxing. They're very happy to be home. Maybe they don't have that much time at home. It sounds as though their parent has passed, and yet they also have this real love of cooking, and in this moment they are now able to relax at home and do an activity they genuinely love. Now let's look at a full scene that also includes showing but various bits of telling to fill out the narrative and provide context. I angle the car into the tight parking bay outside our house and exhale, leaving the grind of another work week behind me. It's been another impossible week of spreadsheets and meetings. I don't love my job, but it covers my expenses well enough that I no longer have to chase side gigs or hustle for extra cash. Time is a luxury I can now afford. I loosen my tie the moment I step through the front gate. Sliding the key into the lock, my whole body instantly relaxes. I can already smell my famous garlic and rosemary marinade. Inside, I pull the battered tray I'd inherited from my mother down from the top shelf and set it on the bench. I'm happy that it's the weekend. So hopefully in this example, you can see how we are switching back and forth between showing and telling. We're not using these techniques in big, huge blocks. Instead, we're weaving them together to create a complete scene. And now this is where I want to highlight that this is sometimes something that new beginner writers don't do. Instead, they'll lean much more towards telling and not include enough of that showing within the scene to really draw us in. Now, the problem with the adage to show instead of tell insinuates that showing is better than telling, but of course that isn't true. As you've seen in these examples, we use both approaches, and you will use both approaches within your writing, depending on whatever it is you're trying to communicate. You'll probably have noticed by now that showing typically takes a lot more words than telling. Writing a scene that includes a lot of showing will slow down the pace of your story because you'll be including a lot more description. But the payoff is that you are drawing the reader into the scene. When we show something to the reader, we are indicating also that it's very important and that they need to pay attention. We flesh out everything and make the scene feel immersive so that the reader can fully experience the events that are being described. Showing equals emphasis. To show something is to emphasize it. You are telling us immediately that it is important if you have gone to the effort of showing us the details. Now, telling isn't worse than showing. Telling allows us to deliver information quickly so that the reader can easily understand what is going on. Telling is efficient as it provides information, insight, and context. There is no room for misunderstanding because you are being told a fact. Bruce is a brute. I'm experiencing another bout of the Monday blues. My muscles ache after yesterday's gym session. Now, these facts can be highly subjective. They're facts in terms of the story and who is telling the story. Dragons, for example, don't exist, but they might exist within your story. Our protagonist might think that Bruce is a brute, but maybe that opinion was formed of a misunderstanding. So as I said, these facts can be subjective. You will use both showing and telling within your fiction, but the trick, as I've mentioned, and the part that people often struggle with, is getting a good balance between the two. You need to be able to identify when it's better to show something and when it's better to tell something. Now, speaking really broadly and at the most basic level, you will tell something when you want to deliver something quite quickly, when it's information you want to get to the reader in a very succinct way. And you will show something when that something is much more significant or it's really important to the story. But as you've already seen from the examples I showed earlier, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. We are often switching back and forth between showing and telling depending on what is happening, and you need to really strive for a balance between the two. As I mentioned before, a common issue with my students and my editing clients is a tendency towards telling rather than showing. They may include some showing in the form of imagery and sensory detail or precise description, but they haven't actually included enough for us to be fully immersed in the scene, to be fully drawn into the writing. So here's an excerpt from chapter 2 of Every Time He Dies that is mostly showing. Now, for some quick context, this scene will include my character, Detective Lawrence, who has entered a crime scene that has a victim that looks like his daughter. "You good, detective?" the cameraman asked, emerging from the bathroom. Lawrence nodded, his throat too thick to talk. He turned and left the way he entered. Outside it was cold, and for that he was thankful. Hopefully it would knock some sense into the old noggin. "It's not daft," he thought, while sucking in another mouthful of air. The nose was too thin, the eyes too big. Really, the poor girl in there didn't look anything like his daughter. He took another breath, slow and steady, and reassured himself again, it's not daft. Lawrence gripped the loose barrier of the landing and leaned over the near-empty car park, wishing for nothing more than a Winnie Red. Now, these paragraphs are highly visual and cinematic. We have dialogue, description of characters' physical movements and actions. We've got sensory detail with Lawrence's throat thickening up, and then we also have the cool air of the morning. We also have the physical description of the victim, which also tells us indirectly what Lawrence's daughter looks like. We're also getting a hint into Lawrence's emotional state First of all, with the thickening of his throat and the fact that he has to leave the crime scene, and then his desire for a cigarette, all of which tell us that he is in a highly distressed state. Now, what this paragraph also does is it subtly shows us something about Lawrence's relationship with his daughter. Why did Lawrence think that his daughter could be the victim of a crime? Does he not know where his daughter is? Do they no longer speak? Is his daughter out there living some kind of dangerous life? Or is Lawrence just a highly protective father? So in this example of showing, we're really trusting that the reader is going to be smart enough to draw these conclusions about their character, their emotional state, and their backstory. Rather than me just point blank telling you all of this, I am showing and I'm alluding to these facts so that you can make your own conclusions. Now, of course, there are going to be times when you would rather tell information through summary. So you might, for example, choose to present important information about your character's past as a summarizing sentence or paragraph rather than doing a proper, full-blown flashback scene. You could choose to do this, for example, for pacing issues. You don't want to slow the story, but you want to deliver some information. Or because the information isn't actually that important, so we don't need a full flashback or we don't need to fully show something. So here's another example from the very first page of Every Time He Dies that is almost entirely telling. Daph heard her heart like a gunshot. Click, crack, boom. She wasn't raised on sentimental bush poetry, read out loud while the family picnicked together on warm summer days. She was shown how to kick a guy in the nuts, scream like thunder, call 000 and hide under the bed. When she was a kid, there'd been weeks when her father couldn't kiss her goodnight because some junkie had stabbed him with a needle and the test results weren't back yet. So, when Daph looked at Tom, she didn't hear lub-dub, lub-dub. She heard click, crack, boom, which made sense. He was a cop too. Now, the first sentence in this opening paragraph leans much more towards showing because we're using sensory detail and we have the image of the gun, which is doubling as a simile for Daph's racing heart. But everything that follows after that is actually summary or telling. Now, I chose to deliver this information as summary because I wanted the reader to immediately have this contextual information about my protagonist. However, even though this paragraph really is telling, it almost feels like showing because there's brief glimpses of imagery and we have lots of specific detail. I mentioned the picnic, the imagined attacker, calling emergency services, and a father kissing his child goodnight. I'm not painting a full picture with any of these details. I'm not describing the food that the family is eating at the picnic. I'm not describing who is there or even what the weather was like that day. I'm also not describing what Daph's imaginary attacker could look like or whether she is calling for help on a landline or a mobile phone. Heck, at this point in the story, you don't even know what Daph looks like. By skimming over these details, I've really helped create a rapid pace that hopefully nosedives the reader straight into the first proper scene within the book. Now, one of the strengths of telling is that we're able to keep the story rolling. Telling can look like informing. We're relaying a fact to the reader. It could be explaining how the world works or how the character is thinking or feeling, or you might be summarizing so that we understand something. This could look like backstory, again, how something works, or information about the character's personality or worldview. Now, we often rely on telling when we're transitioning the reader from one scene to the next scene, or when we're skimming over a part of the scene that is less important. However, as I showed in the example from my first chapter, you can also create telling that leans closer to showing by using specific details and quick flashes of imagery. We can fall into the trap of thinking that telling is boring, but you can make telling feel engaging and lively through intelligent word choice, language, tone, and your use of voice. You'll often find that stories begin with a lot of telling because we're trying to give the reader all the contextual information they need to understand where they are, who they are with, and why they should care. Telling allows us to establish information quickly, but showing is what is going to hook the reader. You are going to have telling in your first chapter, but you need to make sure that there's enough showing, because this is what's going to make us invested in the character and their circumstances, because we are now experiencing these events alongside them. If you're not sure whether to tell or show, think about how significant the moment is. If you've been building up to a big moment, some big promise in the book, whether it's a confrontation or a celebration, you do not want to summarize it. Your readers have been waiting for this moment, so you do not want to rob them of that experience. Now, finally and quickly, I just want to make a comment about dialogue. Dialogue is almost always showing, unless it's reported dialogue or bad dialogue. Dialogue that has been hijacked to awkwardly deliver information to the reader. So reported dialogue is dialogue exchanges that are being relayed in prose. So for example, Henry told his teacher that he'd be late the following day. Thankfully, she said that wouldn't be a problem. Can you see how this is telling rather than showing? We don't actually have active dialogue happening on the page. There's no quotation marks. We're not in scene. Instead, this is being summarized for us. Bad dialogue might look like, "As you know, Alan, the spaceship only runs on the souls of captured aliens, and our supply is dangerously low. If we don't top up the tank soon, we'll never get out of this black hole that we've been trapped in for 3 months." Okay, so that's really, really bad dialogue, but I hope you get the point. Okay, everyone, that's all I have for you on the topic of showing versus telling, but here are some of the key takeaways I want you to remember from this video. Showing isn't better than telling. They both have strengths and unique purposes. Showing and telling are a spectrum, not binary opposites, and you can make telling feel more like showing. I do hope you've enjoyed this video and that it's maybe made you think a little bit more differently about showing versus telling and the balance between the two of them. If you have any thoughts, insights, or feedback that you'd like to pass on, please leave a comment below. I'd really appreciate it. And if you'd like to work with me, my editing services are all listed on my website. So I offer manuscript assessment, structural editing reports, as well as copy editing services. Now, if you'd like even more writing advice, you can of course check out the other videos on this channel, or you can go to my website, taraeast.com, and dive into the archives. Once you're there, feel free to join up with my email newsletter. When you receive my newsletter, it will include a note of the week, a quote, some resources I've recently loved and think you will too, as well as some other tidbits that I only share via email. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. Now go do some writing, because the world actually does need more books.